Hello, I'm Simon Owens, and you're listening to The Business of Content, a podcast about how publishers create, distribute, and monetize their digital content. In today's episode, we're talking about how the Globe and Mail uses AI to drive engagement. For the past decade, publishers have utilized metered paywalls to grow their subscription businesses. Under that model, a reader gets to view a certain number of free articles before a paywall pops up and requires them to subscribe. But how many free articles should a user encounter before they hit a paywall? Increasingly, the answer to that question is, it depends. Publishers are starting to roll out dynamic paywalls that assign varying weights to different kinds of stories. If you're reading a business article, for instance, you may only get to read 3 free articles before hitting a paywall. But if you're perusing real estate listings, you might get unlimited free access. The Globe and Mail has taken the idea of the dynamic paywall to the next level. It's developed a sophisticated AI that's able to analyze user behavior and determine the exact moment that a reader is most likely to subscribe. The AI is so powerful that the newspaper's editors now allow it to automate the placement of stories on its homepage and social media. I recently sat down with Gordon Edall, the person who runs the product team that developed the AI. We talked about how the paywall was initially designed, his experience recruiting data scientists, and why the Globe and Mail is licensing its AI product to other publishers. Before we jump into the interview, I want to talk about the future of this very podcast you're listening to right now. My goal each week is to deliver you insights that will help you with your career, and I'd like to continue delivering those insights for years to come. But to do that, I'm relying on listeners like you to contribute. By becoming a subscriber to my Substack newsletter, you'll help me turn this podcast into a sustainable business. Go to simonowens.substack.com. That's simonowens.substack.com. Or just Google the words Simon Owens and newsletter. Okay, on to my interview with Gordon. Hey, Gordon, thanks for joining us.
Really nice to be here, and thank you very much for the invite.
So you've spent most of your career kind of living between the editorial and the developer departments of media companies, right? What was kind of like your earliest entry where you were kind of sitting between these two entities?
Oh, that goes back to deep history. The first job I ever had out of school was as a kid with an English degree working on multi-platform publishing, where we were publishing to the web and to the internet before that was a thing. And weirdly, the most difficult part of my job, and the part that I actually found most fascinating, was troubleshooting SQL queries to make sure that the printed project and the web project represented the same thing. So weirdly, like the first kind of experience I really had as an editor was really talking directly to developers and really troubleshooting code. And that became a bridge to a career where I was able to kind of act as that interface between newsrooms and newsroom stakeholders, and kind of the hardcore technology people who are really deep in the weeds doing the work. It evolved over time, but that was sort of like an uncommon starting point long enough ago that it really opened some paths in my career that were unexpected. I've sort of shifted over time from more tech focused, more editorial focused. But sort of in this half of my career, it's really been much more focused on kind of that product side of thing, and the development of products, applications, services that really drive performance for the business through kind of technological mechanisms that have been engineered to help solve problems for non-technical people. And I think that's a hard skill to find. There's not a lot of people who have that sort of background. There's more now, though. That's one of the things that makes me hopeful.
And was that in like the late 90s or in the early 2000s when you first?
This is early 90s, actually. So this is kind of like 95, 96, kind of like early days of really web publishing. And it was a chance to have conversations that are common now, long before they were common. After that, I was lucky enough through the dot-com boom to join some startups who were incredibly well-funded, who were working on things that even today would be state-of-the-art if they were being done, but they're still expensive enough to be kind of things that people are wary of investing the kind of sufficient resources in. During the dot-com days, we were looking at kind of doing live video streaming related to, at that time, kind of stock market portfolios, where instead of having a single news desk, we would have had kind of like 5-10 news desks simultaneously recording all of the news that was kind of live at that moment, and then dynamically stitching together D1 kind of raw video to create individual streams for individual users continuously. It was pretty cutting edge at the time, but again, that was like there were just these moments when you had exposure to kind of like areas of practice and problem sets that were well ahead of their time, that kind of opened my eyes to the art of the possible and what it took to do some of these things and do them well.
And you eventually briefly moved into like TV news, right?
Yeah, for a long time, I actually bridged from that kind of like more heavy technology skew, so really setting up studios and recording facilities and really working with hosts to a job being a show producer, producing live television, in an environment where we're doing live 14 hours a day. So really different experiences, different stages of my careers. And I was really lucky at that point that the executive producer that had hired me to run the show, when she had moved on to the Globe and Mail, where I still work today, she had taken a job running the business websites in a world where she sort of discovered that wasn't her favorite job, and she actually wanted something else to do. And I was really lucky that kind of as she was exiting, she said, I don't think this is the role for me, but I know a guy. It's probably perfect for it. And that was really my bridge back from kind of TV back into kind of really building digital experiences, running websites, and moving back into kind of that side of things, which I really had missed. Like, don't get me wrong, TV was fascinating, but even if I was good at it, I think if I'd have had a career in TV, I would have been a very unhappy and anxious person at the end of my career. And so if that wasn't the best fit for me, the kind of digital web development, mobile product development, eventually, that stuff was a much better fit for my personality and kind of like let me have more of an impact, I think, too.
And you started at the Globe and Mail, like the late 2000s, but you started more on an editorial side, right?
Yeah, no, I literally came into the Globe and Mail as it was long enough ago that at that time, running the business websites, which are really important. So the Globe and Mail is, we're 177 years old. We're Canada's national newspaper. Huge focus on kind of business, economics, investing, politics, and governance as well. But that job running the business website was literally a job for one person. So, my day would start at sort of 5, 6 a.m. And it was really a job setting up the editorial tone, the editorial agenda for the day, even before most of the reporters were in. So it was very much a pure editorial function. And along the way, one of the things that I started to talk about a lot was audience and the data that we had. And, at that time, there wasn't really a strong culture of kind of data availability, let alone kind of data literacy. And that was one of the things that that really for me became a touchstone and a place where I really focused in my career, and probably like focused too much too early. It wasn't really necessarily a welcome conversation all the time. I would talk about incessantly about the need to talk about the Canadian dollar. It's a sort of thing that it touches everyone's life in Canada. We've had a lot of kind of volatility in the dollar over the last 20 years and really, over kind of the post-war period. But you can only write so much about the dollar with sort of the general consensus among kind of the editorial side at that time. But the audience wasn't telling us that, right? So when I would look at the audience data, what I would see was a tremendous amount of demand every single time we would write about, a topic that it was all too easy to dismiss. And that, it was an interesting experience to have that conversation at a time when data then wasn't what it is now. And that's sort of, again, that's part of the kind of the launch story of kind of like why my career changed and why now we do things in such a different way than a lot of other news organizations.
Well, it's interesting that like they hired you in like an editorial capacity, even though you had a tech background. But this was kind of like an era in newspapers where they kind of like treated the websites usually as like a secondary afterthought. And if you could get hired for roles at newspaper websites that like today they would require a lot more experience, right? But because this was a time where I'm sure most of the Globe and Mail's revenue was still coming from print. Sometimes they would make kind of like weird hires in terms of where they would put people, right?
Yeah, no, I think in many ways I was definitely a weird hire for the time, but they also recognized that the world was changing. And interestingly, like it was the mix of broadcast and web experience that was interesting because that wasn't, there wasn't a lot of people with that sort of background in the newsroom, despite the fact that we had a TV station in our newsroom. We were producing live television in partnership with another organization. 3-4 hours a day were run out of a studio that was actually physically located in the newsroom. So that need to acknowledge that platforms were changing, that distribution channels were changing, was definitely part of kind of having the opportunity. And then after that, it was just kind of like, what else is there that we need to do, and who can help? And in a lot of cases, I was lucky to be someone who could help.
How did you gradually start moving over to product? Like it probably had something to do with like the rise of like mobile apps and stuff like that, I'm sure.
Yeah, there was actually a pretty clean bridge. So for a while, after coming in to kind of run the business website, I was working as the deputy investment editor, really focused on financial content. Had a column called Number Cruncher at the time, and we needed to rebuild all of our financial tools. So for about a year, I was seconded onto a very large project to rebuild basically all of our financial tools. So our stock quote pages, our stock filters, our news experience with integrated financial data. And that was really a chance to kind of show a different set of skills to the organization, and to really kind of demonstrate that we could do more than we were trying to do if we focused on it. And that opened the door towards really launching the mobile side of the shop. So on the back of that project, we introduced kind of our first in-house mobile applications, multiple applications. So iOS news applications, Android applications, BlackBerry applications at that time, as well as a stock market application. We were really lucky to get a lot of notice for all of those things. They were on kind of Apple's year in review, kind of editor selections every time we'd introduce an update. So a lot of immediate impact, a lot of user satisfaction, some stuff that was pretty cool at the time. We allowed people to do some pretty simple drag and drop customization to restructure the information hierarchy of the news app at a time when that wasn't really done.
When did the Globe and Mail start preparing to launch a paywall?
In 1998.
Well, I mean, the latest, the modern iteration of the paywall.
No, I bring up the original one only because we really did try a long time ago to kind of capitalize on the idea that information isn't free. The original launch, kind of pre-2000, didn't go very well, and we wore our scars kind of pretty openly. But it was really in 2011 that we really started to refocus on the idea that we needed to start to build a different business that was built on some different operating characteristics that were going to be long-term important. At that time, you were already seeing a lot of pressure from some of the other competitors in the market beginning to really siphon market share away from news media organizations. We're always lucky in Canada that kind of we always have some leading indicators out of the US that give us a chance to kind of anticipate to develop capabilities ahead of kind of the need for them in the Canadian market. And that sort of offset was just enough to let us build up a pretty robust paywall strategy that turned out to actually be kind of a sustaining advantage over the intervening years, just because we were early to market, because we had taken it so seriously at that time. It really did set us up for a lot of the subsequent success in terms of building what is, a subscription business model now that punches well above its weight, that's really kind of allowing us to remain an incredibly ambitious, aggressive news organization supported by reader pay revenue in an incredibly material way.
And you had demonstrated up until that point that you could lead teams to build mobile apps and stuff like that. So were you put in charge of like actually building or pulling together the tech for the paywall?
Yeah, so my dev team was sort of a little bit restructured and then retasked on really building the paywall, all of the paywall logic. We weren't using third-party vendors at that time, so it really was the case that we had control over kind of what it was that we wanted to be able to do. And we were really lucky to have some really, really bright leaders. A lot of the things that I built, I claim no credit for. I was able to listen to business leaders and hear them talk about a lot of the competing tension they were worried about. And we were able to build systems that were able to satisfy our advertising group, that were able to satisfy our marketing group, that were able to satisfy our consumer revenue group in a world where all of those people were actually fighting with each each other pretty aggressively, but in a really kind of constructive and positive way. There are some really good lessons learned from that time that I think are probably worth kind of diving into, just in terms of giving people some of the intuition around some of the trade-offs that you have to make that I think aren't necessarily as well understood as they need to be today. When we started talking about the paywall, one of the things that we talked about, of course, was this idea that, like, what is a paywall? It's really this sort of mechanism for introducing artificial scarcity to drive conversion, right? The fundamental idea here is that you're going to take some opportunities to have readers engage with content away in the hope that some of them will still pay you for that chance. So that did some really, really interesting things to a business model where digital advertising revenue was still growing, was still material, important, still is today. I'm not saying that that's gone away, but that it had to be sacrificed to some degree if we were going to have any success at driving conversions. And we had a lot of conversations around kind of like whether or not we should have a freemium model, whether we should have a metered model. And interestingly, we really opted pretty early on to have all of the things. So sort of the paywall that we were building at that time, it had the idea that some content was reserved for subscribers only. It also had the idea that some content was going to be metered. Interestingly, though, it also had the idea that there were other states for content to be in that were more innovative, more creative. The kind of way we explain it today is we started with the idea that we're not talking about subscriber-only content. What is that? That's content that we think is our highest value content. So this is going to be some of the most valuable columnists. This is going to be some of the most valuable coverage areas. So really kind of like a human rules based. We did a lot of qualitative analysis to pick the things that should be subscriber only. But then they were already pretty fixed rules, right? We just said, this is how it's going to be. We hadn't never tried it before. It wasn't really backed by any sort of A/B testing, but we thought it should be so it would be so.
And the New York Times at that point, it was showing some early success with its paywall, but it was a very, it was a strict metered paywall. It had some kind of like absurd number of free articles, like 20 free articles a month. And it was pretty much applied the same rules to every single story. So you took on what a lot of more publishers today are more sophisticated paywalls, where they're making decisions about, the paywall treating content and different kinds of content in different ways. And at first it was all based on like editor intuition. You had you launched in 2011, the paywall?
2012 we went live. 2011 was really like when the build was happening. So
you had some kind of color code system where you could I guess editors could ascribe different kinds of values to different types of content.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was gonna get into, which is like kind of, if we started with this idea that we were always going to have some premium content, the real innovation was really built on looking endlessly at the New York Times, knowing that we needed to do what they did, and then having really smart execs punch holes in things. So that color-coded model, the kind of premium content in our traffic light protocol was red content. We always had some content that we knew would be kind of need to be free for everyone. So this is kind of your service journalism, social justice, things related to policy change, or kind of real kind of brand halo stories that we needed to be free for anything. They got to be green. So we had green and red, and yellow was really the focal point for a lot of the thinking we did, trying to decide how much needed to be yellow, where yellow was metered, much like what they were doing at the New York Times. So every time you would read a meter story, your meter count would go up. At certain meter thresholds, we would trigger different types of messaging, either show you account, not show you account. We had a lot of conversations around whether or not that was important or not, how much people needed to know where they were at in their journey as sort of an inducement to get ready to pull out a payment card, sort of in the vein of kind of like priming from a psychological perspective. But the conversation around what needed to be metered and what the meter thresholds needed to be is actually where kind of, I would say, the bulk of the initial innovation in our paywall happened. because there were some content areas that, despite not being about social justice, were not content that we ever wanted to interrupt people from reading. And so we started with this very simple red, green, blue model, red, green, red, yellow model. And then when we started to think about it, we realized we needed a fourth traffic light color, and we called that color blue. And blue had some really unusual rules that we still haven't seen anyone really do anything that comparable. And I'm curious to know from the folks watching here, if anyone has anything comparable. I'd love to hear the stories of how they came about. But blue was really designed to be something that was metered. It counted. It was something that would hit your count for how many stories you were allowed to read. Except for that, as long as you were reading a blue story, none of our paywall messaging would be triggered under any circumstance. So you could read 10 articles when our meter threshold was at 10. And if you went to read a blue article, you would just be allowed to keep reading that content. And we did it because we had these really, really lucrative kind of pools of value around automotive content, around innovation-related content for energy and some other kind of key coverage areas that were really backed by significant amounts of sponsorship money and advertising revenue that we never wanted to put in jeopardy. The real magic, though, in the creation of Blue, was the realization that we were allowed to build a paywall that was hard to understand. And that you didn't necessarily have to have it be something that was easily understood by everyone in every moment they were on the site. And at the same time we were doing that, we were starting to build up a data science capability. And as we started to kind of post-launch revisit all of those initial assumptions, we started to look at the performance characteristics of that blue content and some of the other metering rules and the intercept points and the type of messaging that was working. What we started to figure out was your paywall is really just a giant yield optimization problem. And if you have a giant yield optimization problem, you really need to figure out how to optimize that problem. And that requires experimentation, and that requires an ability to see what some of the other rules you could try will do to your business model. And I think that was one of the really, I'm going to say, we were fortunate to have a few things come together. We had some smart people. We had enough time to build a robust platform. And then we layered some really smart insight in behind that set of decisions that we were able to subsequently leverage and iterate and innovate on top of that I think made a big difference for us. And I think that's one of the things, if you're building commercial, if you're just buying commercial tools today, it's maybe a little more difficult to kind of explore the art of the possible.
And so with the color code system in those early days, it was just like an editor making those decisions in the back end. Like this, I think this is a red story. This should trigger the paywall immediately because it fits this attributes. And this is a yellow or green story because I think this should be completely in front of the paywall, different stuff like that. Right.
Yeah, that's exactly it. In fact, there's sort of two levels. One is kind of the baseline decisions, kind of if you were to think of a broad strokes, which thing should be what color, that was really made by the business in consultation with Editorial and the revenue group. And then from an editorial perspective, our editors have always had I don't want to call it the luxury. They've always had the obligation to decide what the right treatment for a story should be, and they've always had kind of a veto power over any decision any other stakeholder in the business could make. And that's one of the things. Like it's a newsroom that in our market is unparalleled. No one can really touch kind of the quality of the news gathering organization that we've put together. And so we don't lightly look past kind of the decisions they would make. So even today, after many, many years, they have veto. They have veto over every other rule that anyone else would set down, and that's been one of the important controls. For the most part, our goal has been to try to now get the system to the point where that veto power needs to be wielded less often. And so it's been a really long journey to get there, but it's something that I don't think we'll ever get away from either, despite all of the investments we've made on the data science side and on the machine learning side.
Well, when did the company start deciding it needed to make a serious investment in hiring data scientists?
Really in conjunction with the launch of the paywall. So we were recruiting during the launch of the paywall to essentially bring in a new leader on the analytics side that was different than the set of capabilities we've had previously. So we were really looking for people with a background in predictive modeling, and we were looking to bring a different type of talent in. So there was sort of a recognition that there are other types of businesses in Canada that have really figured out how to manage customer relationships well. We were looking in the telecom space. We were looking in the financial services space. And then we were really lucky because we were able to reach sort of into the heart of research in motion, which at that time was still, a Canadian juggernaut. And in kind of the heart of their product engineering group, there was a small predictive modeling group that was sort of the world leader and had a lot of footprint around the world, but really driven out of a center of excellence that they had in Waterloo. And we were able to reach out to one of their key leaders with a message around, you are able to do some amazing work where you are, but wouldn't it be great to kind of come to a place where your mission was actually to build a better Canada? And that's one of the kind of benefits of being us, is that we're pretty mission driven and we take it really seriously. And that message, that value proposition was honestly put on the table in front of them as a real kind of wouldn't it be an incredible legacy to leave behind, to take your skills and use it to preserve journalism in the service of helping to improve the country? And we were really lucky he said yes. So that's our current CTO, Greg Dufass. He was able to, over time, kind of cherry pick a few of his key resources. His background was ex-telecommunications. Some of his lieutenants were ex-financial services. And we sort of infused the culture with a set of experiences and capabilities that we think was incredibly rare at that time in media. So these are people who had been building predictive systems for telcos to manage LTV, who had been working with kind of predictive value propositions for cross-sell, for upsell in financial services, with an ability to understand how to use data to shape customer behavior over time in a way that was designed to kind of maximize LTV. And we've never really lost focus on the fact that that's really the goal. Like, what are you trying to do with your customers? You're trying to understand your customers. You're trying to serve them better. And you're trying to build a sustainable business on top of the relationships that you have and the set of skills that you have. So how do you trade that kind of knowledge of the economy and the participants in the government, in the market, in government, in the public sphere, for a paid relationship with advertisers who want exposure to the audiences you have based on that expertise, as well as with subscribers who value your ability to kind of open their eyes to what's happening in the world around them. We have been able to grow that team significantly over time in a way that I think some people find sort of shocking today. We're not a huge company by any stretch of anyone's imagination. We're around 550 people. And today, more than 10% of our employees are data scientists.
So you have like 50 people and several of them are PhDs.
That's correct. So usually around 20% of the team is kind of PhD level research. We have a huge focus on computational linguistics, but additional focus really on NLP for prediction, for optimization. There's a few domains where kind of like we have been lucky to be able to leverage the Globe Mail brand to bring a lot of talent in. So a lot of these PhDs, they come straight out of school. We really do spend a lot of time teaching people how to build production systems. And in a lot of cases, it's a hot market. We do absolutely lose some people to the banks and to the big tech firms. But what we found is we're able to continuously infuse the culture with this kind of awareness of the art of the possible and how quickly the edge of the set of capabilities is, and to build products and services that really leverage that capability directly.
And also there's prestige of working for a well-known media brand.
It's the same message that originally got Greg and Mike O'Neill, the other kind of key figure from his former life, to come join us, which is you do get to come here and you do get to help build a better Canada. And you get to talk to a CEO about how important that part of the mission is. It's not just kind of about dollars and cents and quarterly, hitting your quarterly numbers in the way it would be if you move on to a bank. We've actually managed to even get some of the people back from some of the banks because of that. It's a great mission. And the other thing is, we're really lucky to have amazing data for our data science group to use. So the mix of kind of stories, the mix of historical data, the ability to test your ideas against an audience of Canadians, millions of interactions, tens of millions of page views, to essentially see if there isn't a better way to kind of like get our message out and make that connection with people.
So your team starts developing this AI that starts to take over parts of the CMS in terms of how the paywall functions, but also I think content recommendation. And this AI eventually starts to become known as Sophie. Mm-hmm. Talk about that evolution, because obviously you kind of mentioned this before, is like the editorial team had to feel like it had its own decision making, different stuff like that. Obviously, you can't just all of a sudden come to the editors and say, "Hey, this AI that you've never interacted with before is going to be making all the content recommendation decisions now. Sorry, this is no longer your job." So talk about that, like in terms of introducing it, what it looked like, and how you kind of integrated it into the newsroom.
Yeah, so one of the things that we've taken great pride in is sort of this idea that every data scientist has been able to pay for the next data scientist. And so kind of the credibility of the group was really built, as it is in most organizations that are building data science, around kind of building acquisition models, building retention models, having non-editorial stakeholders really use that data and use it well. So one of the things we did, though, was we really did make a point of making sure that the data science group was talking to the newsroom about the value of the work that they were doing, right? We had never really lost sight of, like, at the end of the day, you live and die on the quality of the content that you have in a really material way. If you ever lose that competitive advantage, your competitive position in the market is compromised. So if we were really working for kind of that revenue group initially, we always had a very strong connection into the newsroom, initially sort of through a reporting relationship where we would take the time to have PhD data scientists talk to the newsroom about the things they were doing that were working and the things that were doing that were not working. And this is when some of the most amazing things happened, which is journalists as a group just to tar and feather the entire entire population. They tend to be skeptical. They tend to be ornery. They tend to be relatively impatient, impolite, and correct. And so one of the things that we spent a lot of time talking to them about was this idea of what to do more of, what to do less of, in a world where we're really talking about the work that they do and providing them with direction that includes, like, don't do that anymore. And so one of the kind of key things that we took away from those early conversations was when our data science group would kind of show the analysis around what they should do more of, what they should do less of. We'd highlight a story and we'd say, you guys really need to do more of this type of content because it's really connecting with the audience. There's a lot of traffic. There's a lot of subscriptions. This is stuff that the audience finds hugely valuable. And this other stuff, this is stuff that you need to do a lot less of. And there was sort of this amazing moment where the newsroom sort of called out Mike O'Neill, our chief data scientist, and really the key architect of a lot of the systems, where they said, that story that you told us to do more of, do you realize the only reason why it did well is that it sat at the top of the site for 16 hours on a slow news day, and we literally didn't have anything else that seemed like a better idea at the time? Whereas this other story that you're telling us to do less of, that story would have done way better, except for it had to compete with the Canadian budget or another major news event. And there was sort of this kind of head-scratching moment in the meeting where Mike didn't really have a great answer. But what he did do is he took the time to take the perspective away. And we actually spent around 2 years working on this problem because it turned out that Mike realized really quickly they were right. It's actually one of the kind of core technology capabilities of SoFi that's different than what you'll see in any other platform, which is we solve for this problem that we call promotion bias, which is this idea that if you take anything and stick it at the top of the site and leave it there for a long time, of course it's going to be popular. But was that a good idea? And was there not a different story that would have done even better if you'd put it there? This is one of those, like, it's a fascinating data science problem. There's literally like 100 ways to solve this problem. And all of them come with trade-offs. And so we spent a couple of years coming up with what we think is the best way to do it. And what we found is kind of through A/B testing and a lot of other experimentation is, yeah, you can unlock a lot of value when you start to really understand what happens when you put stories in the viewport in front of users, and you really pay attention to whether or not people are taking you up on the chance to engage with that content. Now,
and so the way that this was kind of to like, how was this communicated to the editor? So like there was like this halo system, right? Like where in the CMS they would say this story is underperforming given the level of high placement it's getting, and this story over here is overperforming given the level of low placements it's given. So what if you swap the two and gave this other one more higher placement or more social media pushes or whatever? Then that's what you want to do.
Yeah, that's exactly how it works. And like the interesting thing is when you first look at a Sophie live display, it looks like a heat map, sort of like what you would have seen from another tool. What it's doing under the hood is actually something considerably more sophisticated, which is we're sort of looking at all of the pages and all of the display contexts across mobile, across your applications and your article pages and section pages, at basically like the total amount of pixels that are being used across all of those pages and the amount of time eyes have a chance to look at those stories. And then we do some pretty slick math to figure out whether a story is living up to expectations or not based on the total amount of promotion it's getting. So it's not sort of a click-through heat map sort of thing where it's like we're just looking at that performance on that page. We're taking a much broader perspective on the performance of a story. Stories that are doing better than expected, they get a blue halo. And the size of the halo sort of shows you how much a story is doing better than we expected it to do. And what you're sort of trying to do with the system is to get everything to equilibrium, to get everything to be promoted in proportion to its potential. Stories with a red halo, meanwhile, are stories that are underperforming your expectations based on how many pixels we're using to push performance of those stories. That kind of ability to very quickly kind of give someone a chance to look at a page and see which stories are doing better or worse than expected is the sort of thing that is immediately and intuitively understandable. And a really funny thing happened along the way, which is David Walmsley, our editor-in-chief, he was looking over the shoulder at his best and brightest editors, his assigning editors, people running the homepages. And they were sort of keeping an eye on things, and they were basically nudging the red circles down and nudging the blue halos up on our pages all day long. So in a moment of kind of like just, I don't know, shocking awareness of the potential to change the way his people were doing work, he actually reached out to the data science group to say, what would happen if you guys just let the computer start to make some of the decisions about which story should run where? I can't tell you how much, like, that's not I go to a lot of conferences.
Yeah, nobody voluntarily gives up control.
No, this is not a thing, right? So we're just really lucky to have someone who really was looking at what his people were doing. And instead of having them play whack-a-mole, he had the foresight to say, well, if that's all they're doing, why wouldn't I see what would happen the other way? So we ran some experiments. We took it as a challenge. We weren't sure that it was going to work, to be honest. Initially, in fact, we were worried about alienating the newsroom to such a degree that we actually geofenced the newsroom so that the newsroom couldn't see what the experiments look like, just to see what they would look like. And we had a small test group of some of those senior editors who were looking at screen grabs before we went live of what a Sophie curated version of a homepage or a section page would look like. What would a Sophie curated version of an article page look like? And so a lot of qualitative back and forth, a lot of work on kind of setting up some rules, some guidelines, some safeguards. to begin to teach the computer how the newsroom was actually making the decisions about which stories were valid targets for promotion. And over time, we really started to get pages that felt like pages our editors would have built. And we started to increase the scope and started to talk more openly about what we were doing with more of the people in the newsroom. And it was actually a process that accelerated much more quickly than we thought. And where we were able to get to a point where now, if you were to show our newsroom kind of a version of the homepage that was curated by an editor, a version of the homepage that was curated by Sophie, it sort of flipped the coin. We're not able to reliably tell who did what. There's a couple exceptions to that. We still have human editors run the top 3 packages on our homepage, top 3 packages on our business page, and they do that for brand primarily to make sure that stories in and around that kind of that social justice, policy change, brand halo, those are still things that we do rely on human judgment for. But after that, for more than 2 years, 99% of all of the promotion slots on all of the pages of our site have been run autonomously by Sophie. And the craziest thing about this is that in that entire time, we have not had one single letter to the editor, one single call to the call center from a user asking if the computer was broken or what the hell we were doing. The reason is it was just transparent, and no one realized that we'd sort of given the machine the ability to find our best stories, pick our best stories, and place our best stories into the experiences our users were seeing. So no clickbait hell, no kind of loss of kind of who we were as a newsroom. We're still really proud of who we are. We're still a very serious newspaper. The kind of tagline that most people would apply to us, it goes something along the lines of worthy but boring. Even with all of this advanced AI, we're still that. We're still who we are, and that's been one of the things we've been most proud of over the course of developing this thing.
And how are the different ways that Sophie pushes content? There's obviously the homepage itself, but I'm guessing there are sidebar widgets on top of articles and at the bottom, at the side of articles and at the bottom of articles where, the recommended to try to get people who finish an article to click more to more. That's, I'm guessing, another way that it recommends content.
Yeah, it's literally all of those places. So it is literally like kind of after you get above the top package on our homepage, every other story slot in every widget is a widget that is populated by Sophie. The structure of the stories, the order of the stories, the selection of the stories, all of that is done autonomously by Sophie. And what we actually do across section pages and article pages is every 10 minutes, we actually reprogram every single promotion slot on every single page of the website. And what we're doing when we do that is we're performing an optimization exercise that no person could ever hope to achieve, even with a large team of people working together to kind of do the same thing. It's literally hundreds of millions of decisions a month around which content should run where for which audience. And that audience piece is actually key, because once you go down the path of introducing automated curation, you can just do things you can't ask the newsroom to do. We've had really tremendous success now with creating variants of our homepages, section pages, article pages for different segments of our audience. So initially we were spending a lot of time on geo-segmentation. Western Canada is different than Eastern Canada. The structure of your day from a commuting perspective is different. Your interest in stories is different. So we were creating regional variations of some pages using basic geo-segmentation. The really interesting work we've been spending a lot of time on now is creating versions of our homepage, versions of our section pages and article pages for anonymous users that are optimized for acquisition. Because the content that drives acquisition is actually subtly different, and we have different content we could potentially choose from if that's what we're really trying to do.
You're saying personalized recommendations to the individual user?
Interestingly, not personalization. So make no mistake, we love personalization. We do a ton of personalization, but it's a thing that we think is another, like, just a lesson we've learned that I haven't seen enough people talk about this yet, which is sort of, there's this saying, right? Give me a lever long enough and I can move the world. Our experience with personalization, and I think it's reflected in the designs that I largely see from people who aren't Facebook, who aren't Twitter, who aren't just sort of running a large kind of data feed type experience. If you're running a traditionally structured homepage or article page. If you're introducing personalization, typically the personalization that you do is in a subset of that page. Typically, what I see between 5 and 15% of the page. And the funny thing is that even if your personalization is incredibly effective, and it can be incredibly effective, don't get me wrong, we really do love personalization. An incredibly effective personalization widget that only comprises 5 to 15% of the experience is a lever that's only 15% long. What we have with SoFi optimization is because we control so much of the experience, we essentially control all of the experience around the user. The lever we have to drive performance is 99% long. And it's just a bigger lever to drive change. And that for us has been one of the key findings, which is global optimization, segmented optimization trumps personalization unless you're really committed to a vision of a heavily personalized environment, which we kind of love the idea of shared news experiences. We love the idea of an editorial agenda. We love the idea that the Globe and Mail exists in part to set that agenda and to drive the discussion and that it should be shared. So we start from that perspective and that bias. And our experience from that is that this sort of global optimization is a much bigger tool for driving material change.
And what about outside the website? Like, is it also making recommendations or even automating the news, like newsletters, what's in them, tweets that are going out, Facebook posts, different stuff like that?
Yeah, we've had really good success with Facebook. In fact, so much so that it sort of caught Facebook's eye, and they were really surprised by this because that's what we've been having. So we used to have a team of social media editors running our Facebook channels, for example. We actually don't have social media editors publishing to Facebook anymore. For quite a while now, it's been Sophie selecting the stories for distribution. All of our content is sort of prepared for social media distribution. And then Sophie's really looking at the articles and making predictions based on natural language processing, the predictive models that we have for which stories are most likely to drive the right kind of engagement when we distribute them off platform. One of the really interesting things that we've been able to do, the reason why like Facebook put pen to paper to author a case study on this, is we were actually able to use Sophie to increase our publishing frequency to Facebook by more than 3x. This was a thing that we wanted to do as an experiment to just kind of see if there wasn't a way to publish more aggressively that would that would drive better performance for us. The funny thing is like what caught Facebook's eye is typically if you were to ask people to grab stories and push that much more content, we were heavy users of Facebook, and to drive that much more content in the channel, you would have expected to sort of run into diminishing returns, where even with the help of Facebook's own algorithms and kind of the way the systems interact, at higher levels of publishing frequency, you would have expected to start to see engagement fall off. If you were relying on people to make those decisions, that's what you would have expected to see, and it's what Facebook thought they would find. What we found was using Sophie at 3x publishing volumes, we saw engagement fall off not one iota. Which meant even at that publishing rate, we weren't running into diminishing returns. We were still kind of getting bang for our buck in measure with the first article we pushed out to the channel. And that for us has been one of the kind of key findings around kind of like, how do you use the channel effectively? How do you use it well? How do you make sure that you have kind of share of mind in that Facebook feed? Well, if you give Facebook the articles that are most likely to find traction with their own audiences, your ability to kind of like supersede that experience with great content is going to drive a lot more performance. And so we're really proud of that. It's something that we're doing for other Sophie clients as well now. And we think that, again, it's hard for people to be able to do that math in their head. It's hard for people to be consistent and to know kind of like how the audience is changing on any given day or over time, in a way that these systems can really help the newsroom make better choices. Newsrooms, again, they can always make decisions to push other stuff, but kind of supporting the newsroom, helping kind of the way David Walmsley describes it is he really thinks his job as a newsroom is to go find new stories. And what he's seen is that if you can find great stories and tell great stories, if you ask the computer to help distribute the stories, you're going to find bigger audiences for the content that you produce. And that kind of like what Sophie really is now is really a distribution platform and monetization platform for content that can help a newsroom remain relevant and showcase its best work.
Does it differentiate between like this story was likely to do well within the newsletter, but not on Facebook, so it's not going to share it on Facebook, but this other story might do really well with Twitter's audience, so it might tweet it out 3 times in 24 hours? Like, is it making those kinds of levels of granular decisions with outside distribution?
Yeah. So the way the optimization systems work, the way we build Sophie in conjunction with our clients is actually for every Sophie client, we actually go through the process of building what we call a Sophie score for them. That Sophie score basically includes every kind of success that you can measure that you care about. So if you care about newsletter performance, if you care about recirculation, if you care about social media, if you care about subscriber acquisition, subscriber retention, we build these compound scores so that at the end of the day, you can kind of roll everything up into a single score where you could win on social, you could win with newsletters, you could win with subscriber acquisition, but you can actually compare performance across all of those domains. And use Sophie scores to really determine kind of like when you were finding real meaningful success, regardless of how it happened. But under the hood, from a predictive modeling perspective, as we put together your Sophie score, every Sophie score component becomes a target variable we can predict for. And that's one of the kind of secrets to the platform is Sophie is kind of built on the premise that the goal of the data is to predict everything. We don't just collect data to collect data. We collect data to predict, and we predict to drive automated actions at scale.
Automated actions include both recommendations of content, but then also how the paywall treats the content, and so it's making decisions about whether it's showing me a paywall, and you as the human being, both the consumer and even you on the editorial side might not even really know why it decided some article should have a hard paywall on it, or why it shouldn't have a paywall at all.
Yeah, today we run a hybrid dynamic paywall that's pretty bleeding edge. So we have some natural language processing that still picks stories to put behind a premium paywall, where we use machine learning to pick stories that should be subscriber only. The crazy thing is we've had tremendous success with a strategy we call small bets using that NLP core, where we are predicting the advertising value for a story if it's free and if it's premium. And we're predicting the subscriber revenue if a story is free, if it's premium. And then we run this arbitrage function that basically decides which articles should be free and which should be premium. It's really easy on the high end with like kind of like your investigative journalism to make a really smart decision about what should be behind a hard paywall. But interestingly, on the other end of the scale is where we found the biggest material impact. Remember, I talked about kind of that promotion bias thing and that idea of finding hidden value. When it comes to some stories that aren't going to get very many page views, that aren't going to get very much promotion, including even kind of most notably a tremendous number of wire stories that you can actually read for free in Canada, we're having great success with a strategy we call small bets, where we'll look at that niche marginal content and we'll pick some of it to make premium only. When we do that, what we typically find is we're actually now doing things like hard paywalling wire stories, where for every dollar we're giving up in advertising revenue, we're actually generating around $10 in subscription revenue. It's sort of a no-brainer once you figure out how to tap into that value store that you're going to do it. And that single kind of small bet strategy is driving tens of millions of dollars in incremental revenue for us now.
Well, let's talk about that. Like, what kind of results have you seen from Sophie's implementation, both from a traffic and engagement type of view and then also monetization?
Yeah, we're still private. So it's one of the things that we don't talk extensively kind of about our financials. But the investment in Sophie, the set of capabilities that we have, and our decision to commercialize those investments and really sell them to other publishers is really grounded in an ownership group that, you know, the family that owns the Globe and Mail, they own Thomson Reuters. They are the family behind the Thomson newspaper empire, with sort of 3 generations of awareness of kind of the problems of the news industry and how to solve those problems. The difference in the performance of the Globe and Mail in the years we've been developing Sophie relative to our peer group have been staggeringly different. And that kind of awareness at their level of just how different we look compared to other news organizations is why the mandate to invest in Sophie was handed down. It's why we think these technologies have so much potential to help so many other people in the industry. And it really does have to do with, in particular, being able to activate reader pay strategies that are simply more effective. When we first started this project, advertising revenue was around 70% of our revenue. Reader pay revenue is only about 30% of our revenue. Today, reader pay revenue at the Globe and Mail is 70% of our revenue. If you were to look at kind of our lineage and any of the other kind of external auditing reports, from an advertising perspective, the thing that you would see is we haven't been losing market share to our competitors. And make no mistake, like Google, there's still a lot of competitive pressure that means we're talking about a pie that's getting smaller. But we've been stealing market share from our competitors even as we shifted super aggressively to a reader pay dominated business model. And that's a great story for our future, right?
And then you've started to do what a lot of other large media companies are doing is like you build this great product and you're like, well, let's not keep it to ourselves. We can make a tech play and start licensing. So how are you expanding Sophie to outside media organizations?
Yeah, there's a few different things that we're doing under the Sophie banner. I mean, it's not really an analytics company. We do analytics at the end of the day, but it's really an automation company. It's really an optimization company. The things that we do with paywalls, they're not even kind of fully featured. It's a thing that's actually one of the things that it's important for prospective clients to understand. We're not a paywall company. We don't do offer management. We don't do offer presentation. We don't do payment. We just make incredibly high performance decisions about whether you should or should not ask someone for money or for an email address. And that really allows you to do a couple things. One is you can still leverage all of the pre-existing investments you've made. You can just make those investments work better by adding Sophie technologies into the mix. And so we work with paywall vendors. We work with CMS platforms. We kind of have some really clean integrations with Arc, with WordPress VIP, with Naviga, and with some more CMSs that we'll be announcing in the future as well, that make it really easy to kind of integrate predictive capabilities into your existing stack and drive performance directly. We have some really fascinating work that we've been doing on the print side of things where using Sophie's AI engine, you can now lay out newspapers in print using Sophie technologies that no longer require you to have human page designers kind of put hand to page on every single page. We can produce camera-ready pages, a full newspaper run in under a minute in a world where that used to be a 4 or 5 hour task for a good design group. And kind of what we're doing is we're just kind of continuously pushing the bounds of the art of the possible when it comes to what you can do with data, what you can do when you have an understanding of what math today allows you to do without losing your own identity. We didn't actually touch on the dynamic paywall, and it's actually a good example of that. One of the things that we sell on the paywall side of things is a replacement for a meter. The way Sophie meters work are different. Remember, I talked about that desire to kind of have the paywall be opaque, to have it be something that everyone doesn't need to understand. So Sophie paywalls don't have a time-based limit. They're not a 30-day or monthly or 90-day kind of time-limited thing. What we're doing on every single page for every single user is we're deciding, should this user be allowed to read this story? Will this user give us an email address for registration? Will this user give us a credit card if we ask right now? The interesting thing about the way that we're doing this is you can actually optimize for all of those outcomes in proportion to their value dynamically in real time across all of your users so that you can achieve kind of the most success you can hope to have in each of those domains without sacrificing any of the other outcomes. So there are some users today on Sophie client sites where even though there's a paywall, they're going to get to read for free. We call them rejectors. They sort of fall into this bucket of people who they're not going to give you their name. They're not going to give you their credit card number. So you might as well make advertising revenue from them and try and hope they develop into a different type of user in time. Other users, maybe we'll try to get them to get out a credit card. And if they don't, then we'll try for an email address later. And that turns out to be incredibly performant as well. Our experience at the Globe and Mail is we're running about 2.5 times better at getting people to register than we were previously, using previous kind of very advanced paywall technologies to do the same thing. And on the subscriber acquisition side, we've seen a massive jump with the latest generation of model that we're using. Subscriber conversion rates are up about 50% off a high base. That's like a remarkable jump for a pretty mature business that had already been running sort of the latest and greatest generation of what are really the deep learning models for paywalls that we don't see deployed widely. We don't see a lot of expertise in the industry around how to use these things. The paywall technology that we run today, our current champion, they're actually the same sort of mathematical heritage as what DeepMind was using with AlphaGo in order to play Go against Lee Sedol. Like, that's an engine built to play a board game that we've repurposed in order to drive performance in the media domain.
I was going to say, like, how long after, a publishing partner implements Sophie, does it, like, how much data does it have to collect, or how many days or weeks or whatever of data does it have to collect before it's fully optimized in terms of the recommendations that it's making?
Yeah, so the dynamic paywalls that we're building, we actually, one of the goals with kind of the challenger that's now our new champion was we really needed a model that learned a lot faster. It used to take about 3 months, and now once Sophie tags are in place and we kind of have like data QA at the level that we need it to be to make sure that we have good fidelity and kind of no garbage in, we're really seeing pretty high performance states reached within the first month, and sort of by the end of 3 months, you're very close to kind of what we expect to be an optimal run rate on this generation of model. So very little kind of like time to value to really see what the impact is going to be for those technologies. For some other technologies, the learning cadences just depend on kind of how much conversion you're seeing. So the premium paywall model can take 3 months to get to that kind of highly performant state. Site automation sort of works right away. It learns very, very, very quickly what's working, what's not, based on kind of being able to observe in real time and see what users are responding to. So it is the case that it doesn't take much time to see what the difference is. And in particular, on a high volume site, high volume of traffic, high volume of content, it's generally quite a bit easier. It's pretty easy to do better than what people are able to do, just because we can make so many decisions at that scale.
Okay, Gordon. Well, those were all the questions I have for you. Where can people find you online?
You can check us out at sophie.io. Sophie is with one I. And in general, we are going to be pretty much at all of the conferences, all of the events. And if you ever see a Sophie sign, if you ever see a Globe and Mail sign, reach out to us and ask us what we're working on. It's been a pretty amazing journey. We really did launch this company in the middle of a pandemic, but we have had some great traction, and, also talk to the people around you, because some of them may well be Sophie clients.
Okay. Well, it's a lot of fun. Thanks for joining me.
All right. Thank you. I appreciate it.
Okay, thanks for joining us. I'm actually on the lookout for new guests for this podcast, so if you do interesting stuff in digital content, whether you're a full-time YouTuber, a media executive, or run a cool niche newsletter, definitely reach out. My email address is simonowens@gmail.com. Okay, see you next week.